Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
The war in Afghanistan that began after the U.S. was attacked on September 11th, 2001, goes on today. And in this new year, a stark reminder that U.S. troops stationed there are still very much in harm's way. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin reports from the Pentagon on America's longest war and where we go from here.
As the Afghan war approaches its 17th year, the body of the latest service member killed in action returned home. Vice President Mike Pence was at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware to greet the remains of Sergeant First Class Mikhail Golan, a 34-year-old Latvian immigrant from Fort Lee, New Jersey. Golan was killed on New Year's Day near the Pakistan border in an area not far from where the U.S. dropped the mother of all bombs last year. 8 years earlier, Sergeant Golan served on the same Pakistan border, shown here, manning a tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missile to track militants crossing the border from safe havens on the other side. Today, the State Department announced it was cutting more than $255 million in security aid to Pakistan, a punishment for its ongoing support for the Taliban.
We consider them to be destabilizing the region and also targeting U.S. personnel. The United States will suspend that kind of security assistance to Pakistan.
Defense Secretary Jim Mattis was asked whether he worried Pakistan would close the vital supply lines and border crossing used by the U.S. military into Afghanistan.
We have had no indication of anything like that.
Since President Trump took office, the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan has doubled to 16,000. The White House announced a new strategy for Afghanistan in August.
We vowed to win this war on our terms, on this soil.
The top U.S. commander said he now has more leeway to pursue the Taliban.
We've used air power, dropped more munitions this year than any year since 2012.
The Taliban now control half of Afghanistan.
In other news, a suicide bomber in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul, has killed at least 11 people and injured 25 others. Officials said the blast happened close to a group of security personnel who were conducting controls on illegal drugs and alcohol sellers. A police spokesman, however, said the officers were there to prevent a possible protest. The Islamic State group claimed responsibility for the attack. The bombing happened just days after a suicide bomber killed at least 41 people and wounded more than 80 at a Shiite cultural center in Kabul.
There's been a reported attack on a hotel in Kabul, Afghanistan. Afghan officials say that a group of 4 gunmen exchanged fire with security forces at the Intercontinental Hotel. The hotel was previously attacked in 2011 and 21 people died. Zia Sharia from our partners at the BBC is following the ongoing story from Kabul.
The attack is going on. Afghan officials have just announced that they have cleared the first floor of the hotel, but the clashes are going on the second, third, fourth and fifth floors of the hotel, according to the officials. The Afghan special forces have been deployed to the area. There are reports that foreign forces are also supporting the Afghan special forces there in the area as well. According to the officials, there were 4 gunmen who entered the hotel around 9 o'clock local time, and they have possibly taken some hostages of the guests at the hotel. And there are unconfirmed reports of casualties. Eyewitnesses have talked to the Afghan local TV, saying those who have been able to flee the hotel, saying that they have seen dead bodies as well as injured people, but we cannot independently confirm that part.
Overseas, at least 18 people are dead following a terror attack in Afghanistan, and that number is expected to rise. Gunmen opening fire inside Kabul's Intercontinental Hotel yesterday, shooting guests and staff members. It would take 13 hours for Afghan forces to end the siege. David Lee Miller is live in Jerusalem with more. David Lee?
Arthel, as you mentioned, this attack was deadly, but it could have been a great deal worse. About 150 people were rescued from the Kabul Intercontinental Hotel. 14 of the 18 who died were foreigners. Most worked for a private Afghan airline. There are no reports of any American casualties. At least 6 attackers stormed the hotel's kitchen about 9 last night. 2 were killed by special forces. Authorities say many of the gunmen were wearing suicide vests and were specifically targeting foreigners and Afghan officials. During the gun battle with security forces, a fire erupted and explosions could be heard. People trying to escape leapt through windows on the building's upper floors. A Taliban spokesman says the assault was supposed to take place on Thursday evening, but it was postponed because a wedding was taking place and they wanted to avoid killing Afghan civilians. The Kabul Intercontinental Hotel is not affiliated with the global hotel chain with the same name. The Taliban attacked this same hotel about 6 years ago. Recently, a private firm assumed responsibility for security at this hotel. Now, Afghan officials are investigating, trying to learn how the gunmen were able to infiltrate the building.
Terrible stuff, terrible news coming out of Afghanistan. We just got off the phone with the State Department. An official gave me this statement, and let me read it to you. We can confirm that there were U.S. citizen fatalities and injuries. We offer our deepest condolences to the families and the friends of those who were killed. Wish for the speedy recovery of those wounded. Out of respect for the families of the deceased, we have no further comment. Remember, this was an attack on the Intercontinental Hotel over the weekend in Kabul, Afghanistan. 22 people were killed. 14 of those were international, were foreigners. 150 people were rescued, including 41 foreigners. But we had no idea that there were any Americans involved up to this point, where there were Germans, Greeks, and others. Taliban claiming responsibility.
The attack at the Save the Children's office in the city of Jalalabad began with a car bombing, then multiple gunmen stormed the building. According to one report, they were wearing military uniforms and fired rocket-propelled grenades. After an 8-hour standoff, 2 security guards and a civilian and 2 attackers were dead. 26 people, including 4 police officers, were wounded. 40 people were rescued. ISIS, as you mentioned, is claiming responsibility. The group said it was specifically targeting, and I quote, British and Swedish foundations and Afghan government institutes. Save the Children released a statement saying it is temporarily suspending all programs in Afghanistan. It reads in part, our humanitarian work in Afghanistan reaches almost 1.4 million children. We remain committed to resuming our operations and life-saving work as quickly as possible, as soon as we can be assured that it is safe to do so.
The attack began with a car bomb at the door of the Save the Children office in Jalalabad, eastern Afghanistan. The gunmen stormed the building. For more than 8 hours, they battled Afghan security forces while dozens of Save the Children staff were trapped inside. The building was set on fire. Eventually, Afghan police and soldiers killed the attackers and rescued the staff. Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places for children to be born, following decades of war, insecurity, and poverty. For 12 years, Save the Children has worked with Afghan communities to help kids survive. But the attack on the agency's office in Jalalabad suggests it's becoming increasingly difficult for staff to help Afghans without becoming victims of the conflict themselves.
It's quite possible that Save the Children would leave Afghanistan, and the onus is on the Afghan government to provide security for them.
Latest statistics on aid worker security show that over the last 15 years, their jobs have become much more dangerous. In 2016, there were 158 attacks on aid organizations around the world, in which 101 aid workers were killed, 98 wounded, and 89 kidnapped. That's almost triple the number of attacks in 2003. South Sudan is the most dangerous country for aid workers, followed by Afghanistan and Syria. The UN humanitarian coordinator calls Afghanistan one of the most challenging and dangerous environments for humanitarians.
Dozens of people were killed in Kabul Saturday. Officials say that a suicide bomber drove an ambulance past a security checkpoint towards the old Interior Ministry building before blowing it up. The Taliban has claimed responsibility. This comes just days after another deadly attack at a hotel. Jonathan Vigliotti is following the story in London. Jonathan, what's the latest?
Yeah, Rena, at this hour, the death toll stands at 95 people killed. Well over 150 people have been injured. This is fast becoming one of the deadliest attacks in Kabul's history. The suicide bomber used that ambulance as a kind of Trojan horse, if you will, to get through a security checkpoint in central Kabul, telling police he was actually taking a patient to a nearby hospital. The interior minister said he then detonated his explosives after a security guard stopped him at a second checkpoint on a street that leads to several embassies. The explosion was so powerful it could be felt throughout the capital, and it actually blew out the windows of businesses blocks away. The area where this attack took place, it was packed with people at the time. Officials said military personnel were killed, but the majority were civilians, some just children. By one report, we heard of a 5-year-old. One man at the scene described it as a massacre. Video, they showed streets blocked by damaged vehicles, the people there carrying victims to safety because it was simply too difficult to navigate through those streets with emergency vehicles. The Taliban, as you mentioned, quick to claim responsibility.
Another day of carnage on the streets of Kabul. This time the bomb was in an ambulance. The driver pretended to be taking someone to a nearby hospital, but instead he detonated his device on the crowded street. The Taliban said it was targeting policemen having lunch, but as so often happens here, Afghan civilians going about their daily lives are among the victims, including people lined up outside the Interior Ministry's Human Resources Department.
I was in my office. We heard the explosion. We didn't know what was going on. So many people were injured. I myself counted at least 40 wounded near me. Everyone was on the ground. I couldn't tell who was dead or who was wounded.
The street was already heavily guarded with a number of checkpoints protecting government offices, embassies, a hospital and a school. The area is usually bustling with people. Emergency services evacuated offices, shops and agencies for several blocks.
You can hear the security vehicles going by, taking away the wounded and the dead. There have been casualties here. This is a very busy part of town. In addition to the High Peace Council, the Anti-Corruption Commission is also down there, just down the street, the UN Mine Agency. And this is normally a very, very busy part of Kabul.
It's the second attack in the capital in a week. Taliban fighters battled security forces for more than 15 hours at the city's Intercontinental Hotel in a siege that killed 25 people last Saturday. Security has been stepped up around the city, but it wasn't enough.
The Afghan president has called on the Taliban to join talks to bring peace and stability to the country, and he promised to recognise the terror group as a legitimate political power.
To the Taliban leadership and every other Taliban member, accept peace, accept it with honor and come together so we can make this country safe and secure.
Well, the Taliban has yet to respond to the invitation, but about 2 weeks ago, the group issued a statement calling for peace and urging US congressmen to pressure the Trump administration into negotiations. It came in response to Trump's earlier declaration, ruling out any possibility of peace talks between Washington and the Taliban.
And we do start the program in Afghanistan, where local media are reporting intense gunfire and several explosions coming from a military academy in the capital. Let's get the very latest now and go straight to local journalist Bilal Sarwari, who's standing by for us at this moment. Good morning to you, Bilal. What do we know so far?
Rory, here's what I've been told by the spokesman for the Ministry of Defense, General Dawlat Waziri. At least 2 members of the Afghan military are killed, at least 10 members of the Afghan military are wounded, at least 3 attackers are dead, at least 1 attacker was detained, and at least another attacker missing. Now, eyewitnesses in the area are saying that the attackers targeted the Marshal Fahim National Defense University, and that the attack started after 5 o'clock this morning in dark. They're also saying that one of the attackers used a ladder which he put to climb onto the wall, and then he placed a blanket or some sort of a cloth on the barbed wire. This is a huge security breach, especially since Kabul was placed on a high state of security alert yesterday. Today was a public holiday. The government had said that it wanted to have everyone at home so that they can look after those wounded in the terrorist attack in the heart of Kabul, which killed at least 103 people and wounded 236 people.
This was a pre-dawn attack. Afghan officials say the target here was an army unit that was guarding that military academy, not the academy itself. The fighting continued for several hours. 2 attackers wearing suicide vests blew themselves up. Another 2 were killed in the gun battle with Afghan troops. A 5th was arrested. The military academy, which is on the outskirts of Kabul, has been targeted by the Taliban in the past. In 2014, U.S. Major General Howard Green was shot and killed there in an attack that was claimed by the Taliban. And more recently, in October, a suicide bomber killed 15 officers there after he detonated his explosive vest. Sandra?
David, there was a horrific attack in Kabul over the weekend claiming more than 100 lives. Do we have any new information on that this morning?
Indeed. You know, there were initial reports that said an ambulance that was packed with explosives was the sole cause of that blast. Now Afghan officials are saying that they believe a second ambulance might have been involved, but that it left the area. It is possible some of those involved have escaped. The Taliban issued a statement saying the blast was a message to President Trump in response to his increasing the number of U.S. troops and airstrikes in Afghanistan. And we've also learned more about the recent attack by the Taliban at an Afghan hotel that claimed at least 22 lives, including 4 Americans. Authorities initially said that 5 suspects had been arrested. Now they're saying that a 6th suspect has fled the country. Afghanistan president said today, quoting him now, "We will achieve peace and avenge the blood of our countrymen." This now as the violence continues.
An explosion in the dead of night, followed by a gun battle that dragged on until daybreak. Afghan security forces fought off the insurgents for several hours before they could regain control of the area.
We used force to defeat the enemies and kill them. We confiscated their weapons and evacuated our wounded and martyred soldiers.
At least 5 attackers stormed a military academy in Kabul at 4 a.m. local time on Monday, detonating a suicide vest and opening fire on security forces patrolling the area. 1 insurgent was arrested and the rest were killed, according to an Afghan government official. Several soldiers also lost their lives. The Islamic State group later claimed responsibility for the attack, the 3rd to hit Kabul in just over a week. And if calm eventually returned as police placed the area on lockdown, residents remained on edge.
Look at what's happening to this nation. When you're not able to control the situation, it's better to resign. What kind of government is this?
Both the Taliban and the Islamic State group have stepped up attacks in Afghanistan in recent months in an attempt to destabilize the country and undermine confidence in the U.S.-backed government.
Turning now to the latest wave of deadly violence in Afghanistan. Just over the past week and a half, there have been 4 deadly attacks that claimed by the Taliban and ISIS-affiliated groups. Top Afghan officials say that they have evidence connecting the terrorists responsible to Pakistan.
The surge has exposed major Afghan security and intelligence flaws. It's also undermined the U.S. military advances in the country.
The U.S. military's show of force intensifying against the Taliban in Afghanistan. A record number of airstrikes just dropped on a training camp, taking out terrorist fighters. The B-52 bombers also destroying several stolen Afghan National Army vehicles that were in the process of being converted to explosive devices.
The U.S. military has dramatically escalated its airstrikes against the Taliban. Just this weekend alone, a B-52 bomber dropped 24 laser-guided bombs against the Taliban in northern Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a record-setting number of bombs dropped, thanks to a newly installed launcher inside the Cold War-era bomber in November. 6 months ago, bombers like this from Qatar would be striking ISIS in Iraq and Syria around the clock. But with that war largely over, these bombers are also being sent to Afghanistan to ramp up the Taliban fight. The new strategy is to take out Taliban training camps and drug labs, key revenue sources previously off limits. Stolen Afghan National Army vehicles were also destroyed over the weekend. Taking out ISIS oil robbed the terror group of millions of dollars, and the Pentagon wants to apply the same strategy against the Taliban to turn the tide after recent deadly attacks in Kabul, killing over 130 people.
A supposedly secure part of Kabul, the scene of mass casualties. A luxury hotel targeted. And now in the U.S. Capitol, new questions about whether President Donald Trump's strategy in Afghanistan is working.
The attacks last month were a real shock.
That's a State Department official touting the new policy and hearing these kinds of criticisms.
Maybe it's time we have a frank discussion, Congress, whether or not there is a military solution in Afghanistan. We're spending $50 billion a year. That could be better spent.
Why do the Taliban want a political settlement? They now control more territory than they controlled since 2001. They're gaining ground.
It was a warm and far-reaching speech in which the Afghan president offered the Taliban a peace deal without precondition. He also promised official political recognition and an office in Kabul if the armed group joins the peace process.
I call on the Taliban and their leadership. Today the decision is in your hands. Accept peace, a dignified peace. Come together to safeguard this country, which has been the result of our sacrifices and struggle.
They were his most conciliatory words as president. Ghani has previously described the Taliban as terrorists and rebels. But now he says he'll not prejudge any group. He even went as far as to say Taliban fighters and officials could be removed from international blacklists. Delegates representing 25 regional and international countries have come together in the Afghan capital to try and devise a peace strategy aimed at ending 16 years of conflict. It comes at a time when all sides are showing they are willing to talk.
The door is still open, and they have shown softness in their stand. Not just the Taliban, but the Afghan government and its international counterparts as well. And I think it's the perfect time. Maybe not for the peace deal to be struck at this stage, but probably for a temporary ceasefire, which could then pave the path for a sustainable peace in the long term.
The Taliban previously insisted on changes to the Afghan constitution and the removal of the US military from the country as a precondition to peace talks. But it has always refused to talk directly to the Afghan government, which it describes as American puppets. The group no longer mentions withdrawal or the constitutional changes. On top of this, the Americans have said the door to peace is still open to the Taliban, and they have put much pressure on Pakistan to help in this regard. The US military has been increasing its bombing missions from the air, while the Taliban has been stepping up its suicide attacks on the ground. But everyone agrees that this war cannot be won militarily. Even as President Ghani was delivering his speech, news came through about how 30 people were abducted by the Taliban near Kandahar, 19 of them policemen. Their fate is uncertain, and it shows that the violence in Afghanistan is continuing as normal. No one is suggesting that peace is about to break out in Afghanistan, but the encouraging signs and language which are coming from all parties are raising hopes here that maybe the first tentative steps of ending this brutal war are being taken.
Here's some quick headlines for you, starting with a Fox News alert. A large explosion killing a young girl and injuring at least 6 others in Afghanistan. The blast happening in eastern Kabul near foreign embassies. Witnesses say that it was a suicide attack, but police have yet to confirm those details.
It's the 8th opening of Parliament, the 3rd under his presidency. It comes at a time of pressure as well as increased hopes for peace. But Ashraf Ghani's popularity rating is at its lowest since taking office 3 years ago. In a recent survey, more than half of Afghans said they were dissatisfied with him and the government. Ghani's accused of breaking election promises. Unemployment has increased, so has poppy cultivation. People are less well off, and it's argued that the country is more divided than when he was elected. There's also been a mixed reaction to his surprising offer to the Taliban last week of peace talks without precondition. His offer welcomed by the international community, but not by all Afghans.
People of Afghanistan who suffered should be consulted, should know that they're part of the process.
The Taliban has been using suicide bombings to devastating effect, especially in Kabul. Attacks included the killing of more than 100 people when an ambulance was blown up. Dawlat Begum's 26-year-old son, Juma, was killed in that attack in January.
Whoever has blood on their hands cannot come and negotiate peace. They should be held accountable. Enough blood has been shed.
This, the latest batch of young hopefuls sitting the Afghan police entrance exam. 70 young women were included in the 4,000 applicants, the highest number to date. It's a career about honour and survival.
I want to join the police to help defend my country and fight for the rights of my people and the rights of women.
The war in Afghanistan has touched many, but few as hard as Samira and her family. Her two sisters, Noor ul Haya and Manora, were police officers in Fizabad in Badakhshan province. As they drove to work with their mother, the Taliban stopped their car, dragged the young women out and strangled them. Their bodies were dumped in the river. They were targeted because they were police.
I couldn't do anything. My daughters were screaming, "Help me, mother, help me." It was terrible.
The family had to flee the province after receiving death threats. Samira still clutches the cord used to kill her sisters. Despite what happened, she's determined to join up.
I am scared of the Taliban. Wherever they see us, they will kill us. Perhaps they might riddle me with bullets or strangle me. I can't go home anymore, so I am determined to join the police for the memory of my sisters and to serve my country.
In Afghanistan, there is a level below rock bottom. It's where these lifeless, expressionless drug addicts exist, men who lost dignity a long time ago. They've been rounded up and herded into one of the country's biggest drug rehabilitation units in Kabul. These are the other victims of this never-ending war, collateral damage, if you like. People who have lost loved ones, lost jobs, lost hope. And their numbers are growing in Afghanistan every day. The 45-day program at this former military warehouse complex is basic and caters for 900 patients. The treatment consists mainly of keeping the addicts away from drugs, but it can't keep them away from the desire. Most relapse when they leave.
We need international help. We are struggling. Drug addiction is everywhere in the world, but unfortunately it's affecting us more. We have double impact. One is the war, and the other is that people are jobless.
Nowruz turned to drugs 8 years ago when he lost his job. He abandoned all hope and his wife and 6 children.
With no job or income, you have no choice but to steal and rob to get drugs. Addicts who have money eventually spend it all on drugs, and when the money is gone, they join us poor under the bridge. We are no use to family, society, or country.
And this is just the latest in a series of attacks by the terror group in Afghanistan this year alone. And in fact, we've seen a significant increase in attacks from them as they seek to divide the country ever further. And of course, it comes at a crucial time for US presence on the ground and for the future of that country itself. This latest attack was carried out by a lone suicide bomber who targeted a crowd of hundreds who had gathered to celebrate the start of Nowruz. It's the Persian New Year's festival. ISIS claimed responsibility soon after it happened. The death toll has now risen to at least 32, with 52 wounded, but that number is sadly still expected to rise. The crowd had gathered outside a Shia shrine and included many young people who had been dancing, singing, celebrating everything that the Taliban and ISIS hate. There had been a wave of deadly ISIS and Taliban attacks in Kabul recently, and both terror groups now seem to be focusing their energies on attacks in the city. US and Afghan officials say it's in response to increased airstrikes and military operations on their part, which they say have pushed the militants back in other rural areas. And just in the last week, we've seen General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as General Mattis, the Defense Secretary, visit Afghanistan. And that's ahead of the annual Taliban Spring Offensive, which is due to start any day now. That's when the Taliban launch ever more attacks in the country. And what we've seen is the US pull troops and hardware out of Iraq and Syria after the fight against ISIS.
ISIS is coming to an end, moving that to Afghanistan. So expect there to be some real pushback against the Taliban in the coming months ahead as they try to break the deadlock there.
Some rare nighttime vision video now showing a raid targeting ISIS-affiliated fighters in Afghanistan. You can see it here, executed by American and Afghan Special Op Forces. The Pentagon saying this killed a local ISIS commander and another terrorist fighter. And Lucas Tomlinson has seen the video and has got the story now. Who are these ISIS fighters in Afghanistan today, Lucas?
Good morning, Bill. The top U.S. general in Afghanistan says these ISIS-affiliated fighters are actually mostly former Pakistani Taliban, which have changed jerseys, so to speak, now claiming allegiance to ISIS. And you're right, this is rare night vision footage showing U.S. Special Operations Forces with their Afghan counterparts. The raid in northern Afghanistan took place earlier this week, killing an ISIS-affiliated commander. But despite hundreds of airstrikes against the group, its reach has expanded from eastern Afghanistan to the north, where officials say they bring in more foreign fighters.
We are following a developing story in Afghanistan where dozens have been killed in 2 ISIS bombings. Both happened earlier today in the country's capital city of Kabul. The first explosion happened near the U.S. Embassy, NATO headquarters, and Afghan government buildings. Then, a suicide bomber disguised as a journalist blew himself up as reporters responded to the scene. Several journalists were killed.
Sadly, this was one of many attacks which took place in Afghanistan yesterday, including one which left an American soldier dead. And it is a reminder of the increased pace of attacks we're seeing at the moment in the country from both the Taliban and from ISIS. This one major attack took place in the morning yesterday at around 8 a.m. in Kabul, and as you say, it left 25 dead and 45 wounded, 9 journalists among them, some of them working for international news agencies. It happened in a heavily fortified district near NATO headquarters and is a reminder of the lack of security in the capital. The first bomber blew himself up at the headquarters of the Afghan intelligence services. The second, though, dressed and posing as a cameraman, waited till journalists arrived on the scene before then blowing himself up and targeting them. Also yesterday in eastern Afghanistan, 1 U.S. soldier was killed in a combat operation along with several Afghan troops. At this point, little else is known about that operation. In Kandahar, 8 Romanian soldiers assigned to NATO were also killed in a car bomb that left 11 children dead at a nearby school. And in Khost, a BBC reporter was shot and killed. U.S. and Afghan forces have ramped up attacks and airstrikes against the Taliban and ISIS, but they remain strong. Taliban fighters are now openly active in at least 3/4 of the country. And just last week, the Taliban announced the beginning of their spring offensive and have said they will specifically target U.S. forces in the country. But we know that the U.S. forces have been beefing up as well, sending in a number of reinforcements, particularly aerial planes and bombers. So we expect the coming months to be more bloody than usual.
U.S. military officials say more than 70 Taliban leaders have been killed in the past week in southern Afghanistan's Helmand province. The top U.S. general in Afghanistan speaking to reporters right now at the Pentagon, updating a war that has stretched more than 16 long years. National security correspondent Jennifer Griffin joins us from the Pentagon right now. Jennifer.
John, this is the first time we've heard from the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, in 6 months. That press briefing just wrapped up as we speak. U.S. officials tell me the incident you referenced in the introduction took place over 3 days in Helmand province. U.S. Marines targeted what they believe to be a meeting of Taliban leaders from all over Afghanistan. They fired rocket artillery on the compound and claimed to have killed more than 50 leaders last week. A Taliban spokesman says this is U.S. propaganda. Last month, the U.S. military launched the second largest number of airstrikes in the past 6.5 years, more than 500 airstrikes in April alone, far more than in Iraq and Syria during the same period. As the war against ISIS winds down there, the airstrikes in Afghanistan are ramping up. Recently, U.S. drones killed dozens of Taliban fighters attempting to take over western Farha province, which borders Iran. In January, A-10 Warthog jets, which fly close air support, arrived in Kandahar to provide more cover for Afghan troops who are redoubling efforts to go after the Taliban's largest revenue source, narcotics. Over the past months, dozens of drug labs have been destroyed. Taliban attacks continue, however, especially in the capital, Kabul, where today a suicide bomber with 9 other attackers tried to enter the Interior Ministry but was stopped by Afghan forces. There are roughly 15,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, about about double the number when President Trump took office, far fewer than the 100,000 deployed by President Obama. General Nicholson's replacement has been announced. Lieutenant General Scott Millard, currently the head of U.S. Joint Special Operations Command, will take over in November. He will be the 9th U.S. general in 17 years overseeing the Afghan war. John.
A powerful explosion killed at least 90 people and injured almost 400 in the Afghanistan capital city of Kabul on Wednesday morning. A truck rigged with explosives detonated in a busy downtown area, resulting in a very high civilian death toll. Well, this has become the worst attack in Afghanistan in 3 years. RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky joins us live from RT's newsroom with the details. Alexei, tell us, what do we know right now about the explosion?
Well, so far, as it stands, at least 90 people have been killed in that attack. Almost 400 are injured, including 11 citizens of the United States. Those are all contract personnel stationed in Kabul. We don't know of any casualties among the U.S. citizens.
Despite new attacks, a top U.S. military commander in Afghanistan says members of the Taliban have been secretly meeting with Afghan government officials about a ceasefire. Now, it all gets confusing because on April the 25th, the Taliban declared their spring offensive. And just yesterday, gunmen attacked the heavily fortified Afghan Interior Ministry. That demonstrated their boldness, ability to attack inside the capital. It should be noted, though, that Afghan government forces thwarted that attack. Meanwhile, the U.S. military is striking back. U.S. Marines fired rockets, killing more than 50 Taliban leaders in Helmand province last week. But U.S. General John Nicholson says violence and progress can coexist. In a press conference, Nicholson called it talking and fighting. About the figures involved in the ceasefire discussions, General Nicholson only described them as mid-level to senior Taliban commanders. Now, last February, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani had offered the Taliban recognition as a political party if they would accept a ceasefire, recognize the Afghan government, and recognize the Afghan constitution. General Nichols also pointed out that fresh violence does not mean a trend of increasing violence. There's been a flurry of activity since the declaration of the spring offensive, but General Nicholson says the levels of insurgent-initiated attacks are 10 to 20% below the 5-year average. And we should also note that multiple ceasefire discussions with the Taliban have failed in the past.
14 people, including children, have been killed in an airstrike in Afghanistan in what was meant to be a military operation against the Taliban. It's not yet clear if it was carried out by Afghan or U.S. aircraft. RT spoke to witnesses at the scene. A warning: you may find the following images distressing. Most of the dead are women and children, Afghan officials say. The U.S. said it conducted airstrikes in the area but had caused no civilian casualties.
NATO's Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan says that 3 of its soldiers have been killed in a suicide bombing earlier today. The Taliban says it carried out the attack. Local journalist Sultan Feyzai reports now from Kabul.
A suicide bomber on foot approached a NATO convoy in northern Kabul in the middle of the city of Charakar in the area called Khalazai and detonated his explosive-laden vest, killing at least 3 NATO service members. According to Resolute Support statement, 3 have been killed and 3 more have been wounded. One of the wounded is American and the 2 rest are Afghan police.
A military intelligence compound has been attacked in the Afghan capital, Kabul. 2 gunmen have been killed by security forces. Officers finally took control of the building from where the gunmen had been firing at the compound. A nearby university was also placed on lockdown. So far, no group has claimed responsibility for the attack. This latest assault comes as the country's security services struggle to deal with a spike in terror attacks.
My friends and I were sitting an exam in class. The first period finished and we went out for break time. Afterwards, all the students returned to class. 2 minutes later, a bomb suddenly went off. When I heard the sound, I couldn't feel anything.
The United Nations continues to maintain there can be no military solution to the conflict in that country.
Afghans will begin voting in their country's parliamentary elections on Saturday. Voting was delayed in Kandahar province because of an attack that killed 2 Afghan officials Thursday. CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata has the story of a U.S. general who escaped the attack.
General Scott Miller made a surprise appearance today on the streets of Kabul after an insider attack that could have cost him his life. The Taliban said they intended to kill the general, but he's not convinced.
My assessment is that I was not the target. It was a very close, confined space, but I don't assess that I was the target.
Well, a U.S. service member was killed in an apparent inside attack in Afghanistan Saturday morning. It happened in the country's capital of Kabul. Officials say that Afghan forces killed the attacker immediately. Another U.S. service member was wounded in the attack but is in stable condition. The incident is under investigation. The attack comes more than 17 years after the U.S. first invaded Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks.
Welcome back. For our top domestic story this hour, we ask, why are Americans still dying in an over 17-year-old war on Afghanistan? On Saturday, the mayor of North Ogden, Utah, was killed in an attack carried out by a member of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Major Brent Taylor temporarily stepped down as mayor and deployed to Afghanistan earlier this year as part of the Utah National Guard.
We deploy people in dangerous places, and our National Guardsmen and men and women go there to help preserve the peace, protect the people that they serve there, as well as represent our country. Mayor Taylor went to do that very thing, to represent his country and his family and our state, and did that with what can I do to, in fact, help my fellow man have a better life. Unselfish service is what our National Guard's people represent.
The mayor's death marks the 3rd time this year a so-called insider attack in Afghanistan has claimed the life of an American serviceman.
A suicide bomber in the Afghan capital of Kabul has killed more than 40 people and injured dozens more after targeting a crowd of religious scholars. Other reports have suggested the death toll was more than 50. The scholars had met inside a wedding hall near the city's airport to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday. No one immediately claimed responsibility for the attack, but the Taliban and Islamic State affiliates have carried out similar attacks before. Muhammad's birthday is celebrated by Muslims around the world, but extremist groups believe marking it is sacrilegious.
Well, 3 American service members have been killed in Afghanistan. A roadside bomb exploded next to their car in the Ghazni province today.
3 other U.S. service members and an American military contractor were injured. This particular region has seen a recent wave of violent attacks. Charlie D'Agata has reported from Afghanistan. He joins us now from London. Charlie, what more are you learning about the circumstances of this explosion?
Well, all we can tell you is what Resolute Support has said in that NATO statement that, yes, 3 U.S. service members have been killed, 3 more wounded, 1 private American contractor also wounded. They have been evacuated. When these attacks happen, we often rely on local officials, local authorities, and a provincial governor said an armored vehicle carrying U.S. troops hit a large roadside bomb this morning and that U.S. Special Forces were conducting operations with Afghan forces around that city. Now, what I can tell you about Ghazni itself, it is an active conflict zone. It's on the main highway between Kabul and Kandahar. It is so contentious that we were there just last month covering the elections, and elections were held everywhere except in Ghazni province because it was too dangerous.
The deadliest day this year for American service members fighting in Afghanistan. 3 U.S. troops were killed when an IED exploded. It's the very danger that our team saw firsthand with the troops while reporting from the front lines in Afghanistan, witnessing the moment they had to detonate it before moving forward. ABC senior foreign correspondent Ian Pannell on what was a very deadly day.
The American troops were traveling in a heavily armored vehicle like this when it hit a roadside bomb, killing 3, wounding 3 more in the deadliest day for American forces this year. We travelled with the troops in these vehicles in Afghanistan this summer. They're mine-resistant, not bomb-proof. Out on patrol with US Special Forces, we showed you the dangers they faced from IEDs when they discovered one just a few feet away.
That wooden stick is a pressure plate?
Yeah, that's the pressure plate.
How common is it for you to come across this kind of device?
Every time we come down in the valley, we've found them so far.
Too big to dismantle, they decide to blow it up instead. The area where the troops died today has come under increasing Taliban attack, showing just how dangerous Afghanistan remains for US troops.
The Afghan government says it's ready for talks with the Taliban without any preconditions. Kabul says it's even ready to discuss possible changes to the constitution. And more details here with RT's Medina Kochanova.
We've heard this statement coming from a high-ranking government official right after the conference on the peace negotiations in Afghanistan that took place here in Moscow. It was voiced that Afghanistan will not set any preconditions for direct talks with the Taliban, including drafting a new constitution, which previously used to be quite a stumbling block.
Nowadays, we, the government and the High Peace Council, declare that there are no prerequisites for the launch of the talks.
High Peace Council, or HPC, is a body in charge of peace talks with the Taliban. It was set back in 2010, and previously Kabul demanded to start any peace negotiations, the Taliban should first lay down its arms and respect the constitution. But it does seem that things have changed now. Afghanistan at the moment is calling for all international players, including Russia and the US, to support the ongoing peace negotiations. Now, the Taliban has long rejected Afghanistan's calls for any talks. They didn't even attend the two-day conference that was held on Afghanistan in Geneva and was co-hosted by the Afghan government and the United Nations. However, the Taliban did send representatives to meet with the Afghan government officials in Moscow in early November, and that marked the first time the Taliban had publicly appeared on international arena since 2001. It does seem that that particular meeting did help to lay ground for future dialogue between the two sides. However, we still need to wait for the official reaction, official position on that coming from the Taliban. But still, there is a lot of diplomatic activity going on in and around Afghanistan at the moment. Now, the next meeting on the situation in the country is scheduled to take place very soon, on the upcoming Friday, here in Moscow, between the Russian and the U.S. representatives.
The nominee to lead U.S. Central Command in charge of Afghanistan operations has revealed to the Senate that Afghan army losses are unsustainable. Lieutenant General Kenneth McKenzie's admission comes even though the U.S. has been training its army for 17 years now.
Their losses have been very high. They're fighting hard, but their losses are not going to be sustainable unless we correct this problem.
There are currently more than 13,000 US military personnel in the country. That's around 6 times less than the estimated number of Taliban fighters. More than 2,000 US soldiers and 13,000 Taliban fighters have already been killed in the war. And in the last 4 years alone, almost 30,000 Afghan troops have lost their lives.